Hello, friends. I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 13th edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. First of all, Happy New Year! The best is yet to come here at Newsbud. So let us begin our weekly examination of the front page news in the Russian daily newspapers. This week we'll begin with Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for December 27, 2016. On the bottom of the front page, there is an article about yet another tragedy that befell Russia in the last few days, the crash of the Russian military plane Tu-154 near Sochi on the coast of the Black Sea. 92 people perished, including the members of the most famous Russian military choir, Alexandrov, who were on the way to perform for the troops in the Russian airbase Khmeim in Syria and celebrate the Aleppo victory. The title of the article is The Delayed Effect, and the subtitle explains that the investigation has focused on two versions of the possible causes of the crash: bad quality fuel and plane overload. Next to the title, there is a photo of a group of people paying their respects to a makeshift memorial for the victims on Sochi's sea promenade. The article reports that the investigation of the crash area continues around the clock. The divers already discovered many fragments of the ill-fated plane, some of which have been brought to the surface. So far, 13 bodies have also been recovered, including the body of the plane's main pilot, Roman Volkov. The article cites the statement of Svetlana Petrenko, who is the spokeswoman of the Russian government investigative committee established to determine the causes of the crash. Petrenko stated that at this time, the committee was conducting interviews with the witnesses of the crash. She refused to speculate on possible causes, saying that the investigation was still in its early stages. On the other hand, the article reports that the FSB, which is the Russian equivalent of the FBI, publicly announced 4 possible versions of the crash that were being currently investigated. The versions are the following. Number 1, outside objects, such as birds, striking the engines of the plane. Number 2, bad quality fuel, leading to the malfunction of the engines. Number 3, pilot's error. And number 4, general technical problems with the aircraft. The FSB claims that at this time there is no evidence that the plane crash was caused by an act of terrorism. They emphasize also that there was a video recording of the moment of the crash. According to the sources contacted by the newspaper, 154 fragments of the plane have already been found, half of which have been shipped to Moscow for further examination. Other things have also been found, including the personal items of the passengers. The exact location of the crash was determined to be 1.5 kilometers from the coast. The article reports that the plane began its takeoff from the very far end of the runway, which is done only in those cases where the plane is particularly heavy. The plane was supposed to make 2 right turns above the water, but something happened, and already after making its first turn, it fell into the water. According to the article, it appears that the plane nosedived into the water as the wings were not broken at the moment of impact. According to the source, who remained anonymous, there are many things that could have happened in the first couple of minutes of the flight that would cause the plane to crash. For instance, there could have been a problem with the flow of fuel. Also, the overload could have prevented the plane from reaching the necessary height. This source, just like the FSB, excludes the possibility of an explosion on board. However, the article cautions that the final word on the subject can only be said after a thorough technical expertise in Moscow. In addition, the article states that the plane refueled in Sochi with enough fuel not only to get to Syria, but also for its trip back. This no doubt made the aircraft very heavy indeed. In this respect, the article also raises the issue of the quality of fuel. According to Pavel Mikhayechev, who held several top posts in the Russian aviation industry, the quality of the initial fuel filled up in Moscow should be the focus of the investigation, because the plane engines did not even begin using the new fuel from Sochi. However, another Russian aviation expert and a pilot himself, Oleg Smirnov, found problems with this version. He stated that while it was true that in case of the fuel problems, all three engines could stop working at the same time, this would still give enough time to the pilots to send a distress signal. However, in this case, there was no time even for that, which means that something catastrophic happened on board. Smirnov also added that even with the engines not working, the pilots could try to lessen the impact of landing. But according to Smirnov, in this case, the plane just fell into the water. Smirnov, who is quoted at length in this article, also raised several other important issues for the investigation to consider. They deal with the general technical condition of the aircraft and also with the professional expertise and experience of the pilots. He stated that from his experience, the airport in Sochi is a difficult one to take off from, and that there have been other cases of the planes falling into the sea there. The problem is that during the takeoff, there could take place the phenomenon of the sea and the sky merging into one, and the subsequent disorientation of pilots. Also, Smirnov raised two other issues that, in my opinion, are very important. The first one is that the plane was initially scheduled to refuel at another airport in Mozdok, and there was a last-minute decision to change the airports and direct the plane to Sochi. We need to know who made this decision and why. Secondly, Smirnov noted that the refueling in Sochi took 4 hours instead of 1 hour, which is typical. We need to know why it took so long. Was there any special cargo that was loaded in Sochi? And if so, what was it? Perhaps in this cargo there is a clue to the cause of the crash. In my opinion, this story is far from over. The success of the Russian foreign and military policy in Syria has made Russia a lot of geopolitical enemies, no doubt thirsting for revenge. The crash came just 5 days after the brutal assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey linked to the events in Syria, and this plane was also on the way to Syria, carrying Russian military personnel. The crash took place above the Black Sea, which is at this time probably the most militarily congested body of water in the world. The navies of the NATO states are in heavy presence there. Ukraine, which has recently seen the upsurge in violence, is not far. Who knows, perhaps the Russian military may have been penetrated by the Ukrainian agents, who since the 1990s always work in tandem with the CIA and the MI6. After all, the head of the Russian military intelligence agency, Igor Sergun, died suddenly in January 2016 under what some claimed were mysterious circumstances in the Middle East. Obviously, the Russian defense minister Sergei Shoigu has a lot of work to do, not only in Syria, but also and primarily on the home front. I even allow for the possibility that the President Putin may be losing confidence in him, or there could be an increasing rivalry between the two. Now, let's take a look at the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for December 27, 2016. In the middle of the front page, there is a big color photo of Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. The title of the article is "The President's Not Showing Up." The title explains that Lukashenko is using the Eurasian Economic Union to put pressure on Russia. The article reports that the absence of the Belarus President Lukashenko from the Eurasian Economic Union Summit raised a lot of questions. According to the article, the official Moscow was trying to downplay the importance of Lukashenko's absence. However, some observers, including the head of the opposition Belarusian political party Anatoly Lebedko, claimed that there were indeed problems between the two countries and that Lukashenko was trying to resolve them to his benefit by blackmailing Russia. Lebedko claimed that Lukashenko wanted to scare Moscow by seeming to improve the relations with the West. He has already received some Western grants, and the International Monetary Fund promised a solid credit line in the coming period. The article explains that two summits took place in St. Petersburg at the same time: the summit of the Eurasian Economic Union and the summit of the Russian-led military alliance Collective Security Treaty Organization. Belarus, which is a member of both, attended neither summit. When asked why that was the case, Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov refused to give a precise answer. He said that Russia was informed that Lukashenko would not be able to attend the summits, but that the question about the reasons should be addressed to the spokesperson of the Belarusian government. Peskov added that Belarus was, is, and will be Russia's closest ally, with which Russia has important economic and geopolitical ties. He also said that the absence of Lukashenko at the summits would not delay the signing of important documents deepening the Eurasian economic integration and military cooperation, because these documents have already been agreed on by Belarus and need only be sent to Minsk for Lukashenko's signature. So far, Lukashenko has not made any public announcements regarding the summits. However, some observers noted that he seemed to have wanted to delay the signing of the so-called customs union because of some of its regulations may negatively affect the Belarusian economy. Other observers connected this with the fact that Russia did not positively resolve several economic issues important for Belarus. For instance, the prices for the Russian gas and oil have not been set. Also, the Russian government agency in charge of controlling the imports of agricultural products has put limitations on the import of meat from Belarus. It's suspected that the meat in question was actually from Ukraine and the European Union, which would violate the Russian-imposed sanctions. This decision provoked a very critical denial from Lukashenko himself. Also, there have been some political tensions as well. Recently, Leonid Reshetnikov, the retired Russian general and former chief of the key Russian geopolitical think tank, the Institute for Strategic Research, stated that Belarusian language was artificially created during the Soviet period, and that Belarus was only a part of Russia proper and could not exist without it. As can be expected, this was perceived as an insult by the Belarus government, and the official complaint was filed with the Russian embassy in Minsk. At the same time, the Belarusian parliamentary deputy Vladimir Andreichenko, who is also a member of the joint parliament of Russia and Belarus, gave a speech in which he pointed out all the problems in the relations between the two countries. In essence, Andreichenko accused Russia of wanting to use the Eurasian institutions to exert political control over the neighboring states. He said that this will be rejected by Belarus, and that the relations between Russia and Belarus must be based on mutual respect. As pointed out earlier, the article also noted the opinion of the leader of a Belarusian opposition party, Anatoly Lebedko, who claimed that Lukashenko wanted to blackmail Russia. According to Lebedko, Belarus has not been getting enough financial support from Moscow lately, and so Lukashenko wants to make Putin aware that he could seek allies elsewhere, especially among the hostile EU political elites. Lukashenko is attempting to play both sides against each other in order to derive maximum benefit for himself and prolong his time in power. This strategy seems to have been played for a while also by the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, until the coup attempt on July 15th made him aware that he had more enemies in the West than in the East. In my opinion, something similar may happen to Lukashenko. He will find no long-term allies in the European Union. The EU has its own political favorites in Belarus and is helping them to take power away from Lukashenko. From the EU perspective, Lukashenko is useful only so far as he is yet another instrument of pressure against Putin. And in case Lukashenko gets too close to the West and lets its agents of influence and intelligence agencies spread their wings in the country, he may soon live to see a color revolution take place in Belarus. Then it will be too late to call for the Russians to help. They may still come, but only under their terms. Let's stay with Nezavisimaya Gazeta, but let's look at the front page of the edition for December 28, 2016. In the middle of the front page, there is an article about the recent events in the war-ravaged areas of Ukraine. The title of this article is "The New Year in Donbass Will Be Without the Champagne." The subtitle explains that the Ukrainian veterans of the so-called anti-terrorist operations are threatening to blockade the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the DNR and the LPR. The article reports on the status of prisoner exchanges between Kiev and the rebels. In fact, the photo next to the article shows Angelika Presnyakova and Olga Svorak, who were recently turned over to the Kiev government by the DPR and the LNR. According to the article, their release came as a result of direct negotiations between the leaders of the DPR and the LNR, Alexander Zakharchenko and Igor Platnitsky, with the former Russian prisoner and Ukrainian parliamentary deputy Nadezhda Savchenko. Savchenko was widely criticized in Ukraine for taking part in these negotiations, but as can be seen, they bore fruit. Now it is up to the Kiev government to reciprocate. During the latest round of negotiations in Minsk, the idea was put forward of the exchange under the principle of all for all. However, this idea got bogged down in the specifics of who exactly was to be released. Each side is asking for more people than the other side is willing to let go. More importantly, according to the article, not much movement is being made on the long-term resolution of conflict itself. Both sides interpret the Minsk Accords according to their own political interests. The DNR and the LPR claim that the accords recognize their special status within Ukraine, whereas the Kiev government claims that the accords require the abolition of the two republics. Clearly, they are still very far apart. At the same time, the current ceasefire, agreed upon on December 24th, is being violated every single day. The Kiev media reports that there have been wounded, even killed, on the Ukrainian government side in the last few days. In addition, the situation may get dramatically worse if the blockade announced by the veterans of the Kiev war effort in Donbass became reality. The veterans want to completely cut off the links of the rebel territories with the rest of Ukraine and stop all transport of goods. The Kiev government officials, such as Vadim Chernish and Georgy Tuka, are cited by the article as publicly opposed to the blockade. They claim that the blockade would further alienate the rebels and make them turn even more resolutely toward Russia. The veterans on the other side claim that the blockade is the only way to put pressure on the rebel governments to release all their prisoners. It is clear that there are different factions within the Kiev government with different strategies for resolving the crisis. According to the analyst Andrei Zolotaryev, who is cited in the article, there is a so-called war party in Kiev, in whose interest it is to keep the Donbass war going in order to obtain financial and other support from the Russian geopolitical opponents. At the same time, there are those who are more willing to negotiate with the rebels. In Zolotaryev's opinion, the tensions within the Kiev government will continue into 2017. However, with the probable election of a more pro-Russian president in France and the more sympathetic hearing that the Russian national interests may receive from the new Trump administration, the Kiev war party might, metaphorically speaking, run out of ammunition and be removed from political power. In my opinion, this is a very likely scenario for the second part of 2017. However, I think that the power of the anti-Russian lobby in Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States is so strong that we may in fact see a last push, an all-out offensive against the DPR and the LNR by the Kiev militaries already in the early spring. This may be preceded or followed by opening another anti-Russian NATO front in Europe, perhaps in the Balkans. The forces who advocate for long-term peace in Europe will not have an easy time. NATO operatives and rogue elements within the Western intelligence community are no doubt getting ready to discredit and even try to destroy them. Now, as a special treat for today, we'll look at a newspaper I have not covered so far. It is called Nezavisimoe Voenoe Obozrenie, which can be translated as Independent Military Observer, and is published once a week. It is devoted to the discussion of issues having to do with the Russian military. So let's look at the edition for December 23rd, 2016. On the front page, there is an article entitled 10 Most Important Events in 2016, referring to the events important for the Russian military. The subtitle explains that the Russian leadership continues to improve the military readiness of Russia. I will briefly describe the events mentioned in the article. The presentation in the article is chronological. The first event is the introduction of civilian rankings within the Russian military. This will no doubt contribute to the expansion of the civilian component in the military. The second event is the establishment of the Center for Reconciliation in Syria. This center was opened in accordance with the Russian-US agreement in February 2016. It functions out of the Russian airbase Khmeim. Its formal task is to coordinate the delivery of humanitarian aid and also mediate between the government and the rebels. The center also monitors ceasefire violations, and it will no doubt become even more important now that the Syrian conflict appears nearing a political resolution. The third event is the first rocket launch from the launching site called Vostochny. This happened on April 28. The rocket released 3 satellites into the orbit around the Earth, all dealing with various scientific measurements, one of which was the joint project with the US and German scientists. The fourth event is the purge of the entire command of the Russian Baltic Fleet, which encompassed more than 100 officers, including at least 50 at the highest levels. The formal charges brought against the officers had to do with the corruption, abuse of power, and diversion of government funds for private use. The purge was provoked by what was officially called the navigation incident involving the Russian submarine Krasnodar in April 2016. Some media outlets alleged at the time that this Russian submarine collided with the Polish submarine Orzel in the Baltic Sea. The fifth event is the International Military Games Army 2016, which took place at the end of July and the beginning of August on the territories of Russia and Kazakhstan, and also in the Caspian Sea. The games brought together 19 non-NATO countries, including China and Azerbaijan. The sixth event is the International Military Forum Armia 2016, which brought together official delegations and defense industry representatives from 35 countries. The forum took place both in Moscow and several other cities and military bases in Russia. The Russian government signed 17 contracts worth more than $2 billion. The seventh event is the massive strategic military exercise Kavkaz 2016, which involved all the Russian troops in the western and southern Russia. The exercise took place from September 5th to September 11th. More than 220,000 soldiers took part, of whom about 100,000 were from the reserves. The exercise also involved more than 300 airplanes and 300 helicopters. This was one of the biggest military exercises in Russia since the end of the Cold War. And it simulated defense against the NATO military attack. The eighth event is the arrival of the only Russian aircraft carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, into the Mediterranean, and is taking part in the Russian military intervention in Syria. This was its first participation in actual military battles. However, according to the article, it appears that there is no money in the Russian budget to build more aircraft carriers. The ninth event is the permanent installation of the mobile short-range ballistic missile systems Iskander-M in the Kaliningrad region, which is a territorial Russian enclave deep into Eastern Europe and not bordering Russia proper. The operative radius of the missile system is about 500 kilometers. Therefore, the system covers the entire territory of key NATO member state Poland and also Germany, and the missile flight time to Polish capital of Warsaw is less than 2 minutes. The 10th and last event is the completion of the Russian Arctic military object Nagursky on the island of Alexander's Land. It is the biggest military object in this part of the world, and it enables the Russian military to monitor all military and other activities in the Arctic and the far north. As we can see, this year has been quite eventful for the Russian military. As the article demonstrates, the Russian military acquired new capabilities and equipment to project its power abroad. In my opinion, the Russian military will be even more active in the coming year. Not only will the Russian contingent in Syria be increased, but it may also get involved in the operations in other countries in the Middle East, such as Iraq and Libya, and also beyond them. Lastly today, let's take a look at the Russian semi-tabloid press, the weekly newspaper Argumenty and Facty, the newspaper with the largest circulation in Russia, the edition for December 28, 2016. On the front page, there is a drawing of a red rooster, because according to the Chinese calendar, 2016 is the year of the red rooster. It is made to appear as if the rooster is asking questions. Where are we going? What are our goals? Are they realistic? Is our direction true and good? It is obvious that all these questions refer to Russia itself. Immediately below the rooster, there is a statement of the Russian President Vladimir Putin with the title, "We have to be leaders." What follows is the fragment from Putin's recent press conference. It is his answer to the question of Alexander Kolesnichenko, who is one of the most prominent Argumenty and Facty journalists, about how Russia has fared so far in the areas of digital and other new technologies. Putin replied that while at this time Russia invested less than many European countries in the development of advanced technologies, this was about to change. The government was getting ready to implement a whole set of initiatives and new programs in the spring of next year. For instance, special zones will be set up in eastern Siberia, which will stimulate research and development of new technologies by offering very low tax rates for the investors. In addition, Putin pointed out that whereas a decade ago, Russia hardly had any exports related to the IT technologies, at this time, the value of this export segment is about $7 billion. For the sake of comparison, Putin mentioned that the export of weapons, and Russia is one of the key exporters in the world, brings the Russian budget about $14.5 billion annually. In other words, the IT exports are not all that bad, and they also show the tendency of expansion. Also, according to Putin, the Russian defense industry can consider itself a leader in the world in nuclear energy technology, in rocket technology, and in some branches of aviation development. He admitted that most of these advances are geared toward the military and not directed toward the needs of ordinary Russian citizens in their daily lives. He said that new government policies would be implemented to correct this imbalance and to spread the benefits of the Russian developed technologies more equally throughout the Russian society. The article continues on pages 6 and 7 of the newspaper, where Putin's other statements from the press conference are quoted. The titles chosen for different subheadings emphasize that the Russian economy is getting better and that the crisis is almost over. For instance, one subheading refers to the formula of growth, while the other talks about the guarantees of social justice provided by the government. There is also a subheading which directly quotes Putin's attack on the corruption and inertness of the Russian bureaucracy. This is exactly what the Russian people expect to hear from their beloved leader. Putin's popular approval is at 82%. However, while his words sound nice and make most people in Russia feel good, they are in many cases only partially true. Russia faces many challenges in the coming year. The economic sanctions are continuing and even intensifying. The price of oil has not climbed very high. Russia's geopolitical opponents have stepped up their disruptive strategies both outside and inside Russia. And so, while it is definitely necessary to be optimistic and look at the glass as half full as opposed to being half empty, Putin has to be careful not to overpromise and then underdeliver. This is exactly what his enemies in the West are waiting for, and they will do quite a lot to make this scenario happen. Some media outlets connected to Western intelligence agencies are already spreading rumors that Putin is ill and that Russia will have a premature presidential election next year. In my opinion, this will not be the case, but I can foresee some unexpected, even catastrophic things happening in Russia and in Europe in the coming year. However, whatever happens, this show will continue the analysis of the Russian newspapers' headlines into 2017. So you and I will definitely have a front row seat. That's all for today, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor.
If you found this video useful, share it. Newsbud presentations are only made possible by our viewers. Subscribe to newsbud.com today to become part of the Newsbud community, where soon you will find exclusive content only available to our subscribers.